This is the Haulin Assets podcast, where we show you how to start and run your own trucking company. Ever wanted to go out on your own? Follow Chris as he goes through the highs and lows of running on his own authority.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to episode 89 of the Haulin Assets podcast. I am Craig, hosting for you today, and over there he is Chris. Welcome, Chris.
Good to be here.
I'm sure it is, because you know what? It's a nice rainy day.
It's better to be inside than it is outside.
Exactly.
Today it's dreary out there.
Yeah, but you know what? We live in the desert, so we could use it. Chris, should we talk about the weather for today's episode? I'm thinking the whole episode, just weather.
Yeah, no, probably not. That seems, we're not that entertaining, and that'll just make things even worse.
All right. Well,
weather's not that exciting.
In that case, today's topic is about hiring a truck driver. Now, we've talked about this broadly before. We've talked about some of the principles behind it, some of the where you need to be as a company and when's the right time and all that. Today is going to be the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of hiring a driver, how you do it, what forms you're going to need, the really in-depth, the stuff about that we haven't gotten to. So this is much more of a how-to episode where in the past we've done kind of when to or why to, but now it's how to, right?
And on top of that, as I've kind of done the prep for this podcast and kind of built the outline, it's actually there. I've sprinkled in some good, more of the philosophy on hiring too. There's some aspects of it that we haven't talked about that we're going to talk a little bit too. But so I think this has actually turned into a really good episode, like one definitely better than average. I think it's going to be good. It's a must listen for anybody who hires drivers.
Right. Well, I'm going to be very interested to hold you to that by the end of the episode. And people can go and let us know, review us on iTunes. If you like this episode, if you think this is a top shelf Haulin Assets podcast, then go give us a 5-star review based on this episode. If it's not, if you feel like, you know what, you guys, that was lackluster, I didn't like this episode, then just forget about it.
Don't let us know, because we do want to get better.
Is that too.
I don't want to stick my head in the sand if we're really that bad.
We'll see. So, as I said, please go review the podcast. It helps us out. It helps other people find us. Strokes the egos, all that stuff. No,
I need ego stroking.
It is a good way for somebody goes on to iTunes or Spotify or something, or Google for that matter, and they search for a podcast. They say, owner operator podcast, something like that. People are making these searches, and for every person that goes in and gives us a review on these services, whatever it is that you use, that helps us out, helping other people find us. So we appreciate also, obviously sharing us on social media and all that stuff, but even just a positive review goes a long way. So also go to haulinassetslllc.com for full show notes. You can comment there. Find us on Facebook. Housekeeping over. Chris, I think did I cover everything?
Yeah, you went pretty deep into it today.
Yeah, well, this, it was a heartfelt plea. Okay.
I felt it.
There you go. All right. So Chris, how do you want to start in on this topic of the mechanics of hiring a driver?
Well, before we actually get into the mechanics of hiring a driver, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about somebody that I've always admired and always looked up to. Even before, like as I was getting out of my late teens and into my young adulthood, Colin Powell, as you may or may not know, passed away
last
very
month,
recently.
Wasn't it?
But yeah, it may have even been in the last couple of weeks. They just had his funeral was just late last week.
Yeah.
And
an impressive guy for sure.
Very impressive guy. And I've always felt that way. I've kind of followed his career, and, with his passing, I've actually never read one of his books. I started reading one of his books and have learned even more about him, and just an incredible, incredible person. Somebody we should all look up to, all admire and learn from. And so in the book that I've been reading, it's called, I can't even think of the title, and I don't have it written down here. It's called "It Worked for Me."
Oh, there you go. Okay,
it worked for me. He goes through 13 of his rules, basically kind of rules in life, and I just wanted to talk about a few of them as we kind of get into this, because I think they're really good. All 13 of them are great. I'd encourage you to go listen to his book or read his book, and really understand those 13 rules. But three of them kind of really stuck out to me. The first one was perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. Force multiplier.
That's a military.
It's a military term, and so it basically means that a force multiplier is something that basically brings more to the battlefield than anything. I think I was trying to think of how can I explain what a force multiplier is, and I think a good example would be a machine gun. One machine gun will do as many, will do as much as 5 people shooting single shot rifles.
Probably
right?
a lot. Probably a lot more
even
than
more.
That. Yeah.
So a machine gun is a good example of a force multiplier.
So the idea being you can have one person added to the battlefield, and they're going to be if they have a force multiplier, they're going to be worth more than just one person on the battlefield, right?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
That's a great way to put it. So Colin Powell says that perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. And I see that. And I think that's actually, for somebody that's an entrepreneur, a business owner, I've seen very few successful entrepreneurs who aren't super optimistic people.
Yeah.
And the reality behind it is, if you're always pessimistic, if you've got kind of this negative view on things, are you going to jump in and risk things? Are you going to, put in extra effort to, become successful? Probably not. I think that optimism in entrepreneurship is an absolute requirement.
Okay, good. And what's the next one?
The next one is...
And now, are we going to do all 13 of these?
No, just 3.
Okay.
We're just going to do 3.
All right.
The next one is get mad, then get over it.
I love this.
I do too.
What
do you like about it?
It's... Anger is really useful, in the right situations. It's a good motivator for a lot of reasons, but it's like salt. Or let me back up and put it this way: any poison is determined by the dosage, right? So salt, a little bit of salt can go a long way toward making your meal more flavorful, but a lot of salt will kill you. And anger is a lot like that, where it's really useful in a lot of situations as a motivator or as a communicating emotion. But then if you hang on to it for too long, it can really eat at you. Oops, I hit the mic. It can really eat at you and make you miserable, salty, if you will, right? So that's what comes to mind for me.
Did you just pull that analogy out of thin air? That was pretty good. I like that. That's a good way of looking at it.
I did steal it from somebody, but it doesn't matter who. So
that's good. But yeah, anger, I agree. It's something that, kind of held within certain confines is a good thing. And it's something that happens to all of us. And you get a little bit mad. It kind of motivates you. It kind of helps you get your point across to people, but then you get over it. You move on and you kind of put it behind you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's number 3 then?
Number 3 is it ain't as bad as you think, and it will look better in the morning. And I have always lived by this. Like you get bad news, you have a bad day, and it's hard. And I tell my wife all the time, like it's been a rough day. I just need to sleep on it. I'll be better in the morning. And it's amazing what a good, solid 8 hours of passing time, sleeping, and waking up the next day, how it can give you kind of a new perspective, and things can calm down. So I really like that one too. It's not as bad as you think, and it'll look better in the morning. Just kind of sleep it off.
Yeah, it actually kind of feeds into both of the other ones, right?
Yeah.
Be optimistic and be angry, but not for too long, right? Yep. So yeah, okay, good. So do you want to try to tie these into hiring a truck driver, or is this a tangent for you?
It's just
Chris?
a tangent for me. Actually, it is kind of funny because I think we will talk about one of them. It just happened to kind of come up later on, so we'll point back to one of these 3 in a minute.
Yeah, but
it's more just because I pay a little tribute to somebody who has done a ton for our country. I think Colin Powell's just he's just a good quality, genuine, good person. I wish he would have run for president. I think he would have made a great president.
Well, there you go. Hot take from Chris.
There you go.
All right. Chris, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of hiring a driver. Okay, so where do you want to start with this one? Because you've hired now how many drivers?
We just hired our 5th.
We've got the driver. Yep. Wow.
5th driver hasn't started yet.
Okay.
But should start here in the next couple of weeks. We should have the truck number 5 coming online and get going. But one of the things that, just to kind of put this into context and how important I think this is, I was thinking a little bit about, drivers And I started typing the show notes on the our website, on the webpage, and I put hiring or drivers are one of the key or one of the most important ingredients of running a successful trucking company.
Yeah.
And then I start thinking a little bit about it, and I'm like, no, you know what? Drivers are the key ingredient to a successful trucking company. You cannot have a successful trucking company without a good driver. Like I would even argue the same, that holds true for an owner operator. You are the driver, but if you're an unreliable driver, your business is gonna fail.
Well, yeah, going back to something that we talked about early on in the podcast, when you were looking for a truck, you weren't going for the fanciest, newest thing out there. You were going for something that you knew would be reliable, but you wanted to get a deal on it. You were hoping not to pay too much. Or you remember the interview we did with Bubba Blackwell, where he went out, got a really cheap truck, and he was able to succeed. We should check in with him. As far as we know, he's still succeeding. A little bit.
Yeah, he's still doing pretty well.
But my point is, he got a really cheap truck. He was the key ingredient. Yep. So it's not about having the fanciest truck or whatever the other things are. These are important things. The truck is an important part of things. The contacts that you make, that's an important part of things. But the driver who actually makes the truck go is going to be far more important.
Yeah,
right?
The driver is absolutely critical. You can't. The driver really is the key ingredient to a successful trucking company. So the driver can't do it all on their own, but it never works unless you've got a good driver.
So how do you determine whether somebody is quality or not?
That's a good question, and we're going to kind of dive into those a little bit. But to kind of get their ball rolling, I think one of the things that we have found that's important to us in finding that good driver, in part of our screening process, is we basically require an in-person interview.
So no video interviews for people, or phone interviews.
We maybe do a video interview, definitely not a phone interview. Yeah, I think you need to be able to look at the person. And in reality, like our success, when we've been successful at hiring drivers, we've been able to look at the driver in the eye, shake their hand. And I think it's good for both parties. I don't think it's just good for the us as the company. I think it's good for the driver to be able to look in your eyes and shake your hand and really get to know who you are a little bit better. And so I think that face-to-face interview is important. Those personal interactions kind of help reduce the number of times that we've been stood up by people who say, yeah, I'm interested, but end up not being. And then, we feel like it really makes it so that you're more committed to the driver because you've got to know him, you feel good about him, you feel comfortable with him, and the driver's more committed to the company for the same reason. They've gotten to know you and they feel a little bit more comfortable. So I think that in-person interview just drastically increases your chance of having a good hire.
Yeah,
and being a good fit.
And so, what sort of guiding principles do you have during that in-person interview? Because, like you said, this is as much about interviewing them as it is about them interviewing you. It's a two-way street.
We'll
right?
talk a little bit about that, but we really hit that in episode 83.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about kind of some of the questions we ask and the things that we go through when we hire a driver, and that's that face-to-face interaction just gives you a little bit better. A way to better feel those answers, kind of feel the person out, and make sure that they're you're really going to have one of those win-win relationships, because that's really what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And another thing, and this doesn't necessarily tie directly into the in-person interviews, but another thing that we've found is incredibly important is to be completely upfront and honest with the driver that you're hiring. Don't just share the pros and the cons. Oftentimes as a driver, they're trying to present themselves in the best light. You as a company, you're trying to present yourself in the best light, which you want to do to a certain extent, but you also don't want to put blinders on the other individual, the driver, because if you're kind of telling them one thing or leading them to believe one thing, and then the reality of how you operate and what the job is for them is different, it's just going to create problems down the road.
Right. They show up on day one and it's like, wait a minute. You want me to know how much about being a mechanic, working on my own truck. You didn't tell me any of that.
Well, and you think about it, there's no company out there that's a perfect company. There's some companies, every company has kind of the pros.
Obvious exception of Haulin Assets. I mean,
we're pretty close, but I have to, there's a reality check. We're not perfect. There's some things that, we could do better, but you take, for example, like we're trying to paint ourselves in the best light. Well, we don't currently hope, it's our goal to someday, but we don't currently offer health insurance. That's one thing that we make sure the drivers understand abundantly clear up front, that we don't currently offer health insurance. And then another thing that's a little bit of a headache is we don't have a really good detention policy. It's one of the things that we're trying to work on, I think, as we get a little bit bigger and things are a little bit more predictable for us. We do pay detention, but it's kind of on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on a lot of factors. And so we kind of walk through with drivers, definitely those two things, just, kind of a few other things, because we want to make sure that they understand, how we operate, make sure that there's no surprises or as few as surprises as possible. That's important so that they feel comfortable. And, and another one of the things that kind of a philosophy that I like to live by, and Colin Powell actually talked a little bit about this in his book too.
Well, fancy that.
Imagine that is, bad news never gets better with time. It typically gets worse. And so, like, if you've got one of those things that's ultimately going to cause an issue with your driver, like detention, it's going to come up at some point. And if you don't kind of address that early on, it's just going to be a bigger problem compounded later on down the road.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Kind of like the opposite of a force multiplier.
Okay. Force divider.
Yeah, all right. There you go.
So we've talked in the past, again, kind of zooming out to the theory, the philosophy behind hiring a driver. We've talked about what you'd be looking for. You want a safe driver, and you want a driver who's a good fit, kind of this thing that you're talking about. They understand what you're going to be asking of them, and you understand what they're going to be able to deliver, right? But what does that look like, again, getting into the nuts and bolts? How do you determine these things? How do you find out that sort of thing about a potential driver candidate?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we'll talk about it. So that's the first thing we're looking for, obviously, like you just mentioned, is that we're looking for somebody that we know is going to be safe. And the reason behind that is that I think we've talked a little bit about this situation in the podcast. There was a couple years ago in Utah, there was a truck driver he's a dump truck driver, so, had a CDL, local driver. And he was drunk, and I think he was high on drugs and speeding and kind of other issues. Anyway, he ended up getting in a wreck and killing 6 people. Ugh. And it's one of those situations where that driver never should have been hired. He'd had previous DUIs. He'd had other issues. He'd driven on a suspended license, all kinds of issues, and never should have been hired. And so that's one of the reasons that this screening process is so critical, is because you don't want to hire a driver like that.
Right.
That's kind of an extreme example, but you don't want to hire somebody that's even close to that.
And the most important aspect of that, I think, would be the morality of hiring a driver who you don't want to hire. But there's also practical reasons. You don't want to be on the hook for somebody who did something dumb under the banner of your company, right?
They're out there representing you, and the last thing you want is your company in the headlines because of a bad situation.
Right.
So how do you do that, right? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now. So let's go into kind of some of the steps, some of the things that we do, which some of them aren't required, but a lot of them are actually required. And we'll talk. So let's talk a little bit about that. And some of this is going to seem really obvious, but I want to go through all the steps.
Hey, we're talking about nuts and bolts for a reason. Let's do some nuts and bolts.
So the first one is you have them fill out an employment application.
Okay. So that sounds super duper basic. I'm wondering, and let me see if I can interject what you might be thinking here, Chris. I'm going to read your mind. You want them to complete an employment application partly just because you want to see how, you could find this information on LinkedIn or just ask them for it. But if they actually go in and fill out the application, you know that this person actually wants to do the job, and that they have the follow through necessary to complete something as simple as an employment application. So they're going to be keeping, hopefully that's an indication that they're going to be keeping good records while they're on the road. Staying in good communication, that sort of thing, right? Yeah,
it shows a little bit of commitment on their side. So yeah, it is good because once you get past the employment application piece, it's a lot of the things you have to do start costing money. And so you want to make sure they've got kind of that level of commitment before you start incurring expenses through the screening process.
Right.
So it does show that kind of level of commitment. And there's also some basic information on it that you need to get, like some of the previous employers. A lot of the information you can just get like from a copy of their CDL, but which you have to get anyway, but you want them to show that level of commitment. And there's some other things on the employment application that you need to get.
Right. Okay. So what's next?
So I mentioned that they need to provide some of the previous employers in the inquiries.
Or so that you can do inquiries, right?
Yes, they need to provide it, yes, so that then we can go do previous employer inquiries, which is a requirement of the DOT. So one of the things you have to kind of keep in mind is you want an application that's kind of specific to the Department of Transportation, because there are some key ingredients in it that you need to get that you don't necessarily need to get on for other types of jobs. And it is one of those things that you can get from Motor Carrier HQ. We've got it's part of our audit package. It includes an employment application that you can use. But you need to get that. Then you also need to get a copy of the front and back of their CDL, or if they're not a commercial driver's license, if they don't have a CDL, say they're operating vehicles under 26,000 pounds, a copy of their regular driver's license.
Okay. Just for your own files, or?
Yep. You've got to have it for your own files. There's something called
another requirement. Then.
It is. There's what's called a driver qualification file. Sometimes people refer to it as the DQ file. You've got to have one for each one of your drivers. When you get audited, the auditors are going to ask for that and want to see. And that's something that needs to be in there. And again, that's our audit assistance package at Motor Carrier HQ includes all that information. So it kind of makes it pretty self-explanatory.
What was that, Chris? Motor Carrier HQ?
Motor Carrier HQ.
MotorCarrierHQ.com?
They were doing a shameless plug.
That's
for
right.
One of our businesses.
You can always count on me.
We need to do that a little more often.
Okay, so you got a copy of their license. What's next?
Next is, and this is something that's not required, but I think you're crazy not to do it, is you need to get what's called the Pre-Employment Screening Program Report. So it's an FMCSA report that goes back and pulls. It's kind of like your motor vehicle record, but it's more specific to hours of service and vehicle inspections.
Okay.
So anytime a driver is driving down the road and they get pulled in for a safety inspection, a safety inspection report is typically submitted, and it shows that either there were no violations or it shows if there was a violation. So when you pull the pre-employment screening program report, it will show for that driver if they've had in the last, it's either 2 or 3 years. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but it'll show in the last 2 or 3 years how many hours of service violations they've had, if they've had any vehicle maintenance violations when they've been inspected, just that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And you said that's not required. Why do you want it on file if you don't have to have it?
Because it's not just having it on file. It's the matter of making sure you're hiring a good driver, because, this is kind of, again, let's go back to the force multiplier thing. We talk a little bit about safety scores and being in compliance with the Department of Transportation regulations. One bad driver who has a history of hours of service violations, or maybe they're just lazy and never do their pre-trip inspections. So there's a light out on a trailer that's been out forever and they don't notify you about it. You don't know it needs to get fixed. It never gets fixed. And so it pops up on a report. That kind of thing, a driver that does that, one bad driver in a small fleet can just cause your safety scores to skyrocket. So they're kind of like that force divider, you would say.
Sure.
They cause...
What it reminds me of is any system is only as strong as the weakest component.
Yeah.
Right. And so whoever is your worst driver when it comes to safety, that's the score your company's going to eventually get. Right.
I would say 50% of the time that we would deal with companies that have safety problems, it's usually one driver.
Yeah.
Like you may have 5 great drivers and one bad one, and that one bad one is causing all of your problems.
Yeah. What about drug testing? You guys do drug testing?
Yep. So that's the next thing. They got to do a pre-employment drug test. That's another one of those things that's required. You've got to get a consent from the driver to do it, but have to do it. And kind of married with that is the clearinghouse inquiry, which, if a truck driver has tested positive of a drug test, their information gets entered into the clearinghouse. And so when you pull a clearinghouse report for that driver, it will show that they've had a previous violation.
Yeah. Okay. What's next?
After that is you need to get approval from your insurance agency that they're qualified to be on your policy.
Oh, okay.
So you actually have to provide the driver's information to your insurance agent, basically just making sure that they're okay to have. Like you take, for instance, on our insurance policy, we can't have drivers that have less than 2 years of driving experience. Or if there's, most policies, if there's a certain number of violations that disqualifies a driver, they've had a certain number of accidents, especially if they're at fault accidents, they'll be disqualified from your policy. And so you just can't hire a driver that doesn't meet the insurance qualifications.
Which reminds me of a question I want to be sure to ask you before we move on to the next section. But let's go ahead and finish this one up, finding out if they're a safe driver. What other things are we looking for?
The last thing I want to talk about is their MVR, which is their motor vehicle record. So this is basically what shows like what kind of tickets they've had. So a lot of times people get confused between the MVR and the PSP, or the pre-employment screening program report. They're two different things. And sometimes, like a lot of times, a speeding violation will be on the PSP report. So it'll be on the MVR and the PSP report. But hours of service violations and vehicle inspection issues, none of that's ever going to show up on the MVR. That's more like your moving violations type thing, your illegal lane changes, running red lights, speeding, that'll show up on the MVR. So you have to have a copy of that. And one thing that I want to share is this is happening more and more in the industry. You've got Adobe PDF programs, and it becomes really easy to manipulate MVR reports. And so you need to make sure you get one, from a third party, from a source where a driver hasn't had an opportunity to manipulate it.
How would you do that? Who would you go to get that? What third party are you thinking of?
There are some third parties that are out there. Sometimes your insurance agent will provide you one, but more often than not, you can go to the state driver's license division and get it. You probably have to get a consent form from the driver allowing you to pull it, but you can pull it directly.
Okay. So let me run through that list again just to refresh, and then I'll ask you my question. We've got this driver needs to complete an employment application in its entirety. You're going to do previous employer inquiries, and we want a copy of the CDL front and back. We do a pre-employment screening program report. Okay.
You're getting it.
Which, by the way, there's a link to that. There's a link to a few of these things on HaulinAssetsLLC.com.
I put all these in the show notes, so you don't have to necessarily take notes. Just go to the show notes, and all this is listed out there.
So we've got those. We got the pre-employment drug tests, the insurance aspect. Can they be covered by your insurance, and the motor vehicle record? So all of these things,
and the clearinghouse.
Oh, and the clearinghouse. Yes, thank you. All of these things. My question is, when in the process are you doing them? Is this all before you extend an offer to somebody? You have all of these things in place, all of these questions answered, or do some of these come after you have extended the offer and that person is presumably coming on with your company?
So most of those things. So typically, kind of our process is we'll have, we'll put out a job posting.
Mm-hmm.
People will respond to it, and we'll call and talk to them on the phone. And, we've got a handful of questions that we'll ask when we're kind of screening them on the phone. And if we feel good about the phone interview, that's when we'll schedule that face-to-face interview. And that's kind of the next step. And once we do the face-to-face interview and we feel really good about the person, that's when we really start to get serious. So we'll give them the application and then kind of go through those points. So
you're giving them the application after the face-to-face interview.
After the face-to-face interview.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not just somebody went on Indeed.com, filled out the application, and that's good enough.
No, there's different methods to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can have somebody fill the application out before you meet with them, but that's just not how we've done it. But I definitely would say that by the time we kind of have them going through those steps and doing those things, we want to hire those people. We're just really looking for reasons why it probably shouldn't hire them.
Okay. All right. So all right, so we've gone through how to determine if this person is a safe driver, but now you want to find out, you said the other part of this is whether they're a good fit.
Yep.
Obviously, being a safe driver is part of that, but there's more that goes into it. Are they going to be good for your company, and is your company going to be good for them? How do you determine that? And
you want that good fit both ways. If it's not a good fit both ways, eventually the relationship's not going to work. So this is where I'm not going to go super far into this because this is the episode 83. We talk a decent more about this, but that first in-person meeting with the driver, a lot of times, where Haulin Assets doesn't have its own office. I can use some of my other businesses as an office, but we've often found it's better. We'll do it at a restaurant, and we'll go and meet them, buy them a lunch somewhere, and it kind of helps people relax a little bit. I feel like you kind of get an opportunity to meet them in a more neutral territory, more friendly environment. They kind of like that. And so we kind of start to ask those questions about like how they like to run. We talk to them about our company and how we like to run. We make sure we're kind of both on the same page that way.
Yeah. Well, here come the jets. They're going to, I think, bomb the studio, but they're not so loud that we can't keep going. But thank you, Air Force.
Let them run in the background.
That's right. All right. So, so you're meeting them in person. We've talked in the past about asking questions about how do you like to run? Here's how we like to run. Does this match up? What else are you doing to determine this, to find out if they're a good fit for the company?
So the last thing that we kind of really do on that, good fit for each other is we'll have the driver and the dispatcher. We'll get on like a 3-way phone call with the driver, the dispatcher, and either Nate or I, typically Nate, and just make sure that
Nate being
our business partner,
right.
Haulin Assets. Yeah.
Just making sure people remember.
And just make sure they both feel good about each other. And we love Jake. Jake's awesome, and he's driven, so he understands it, and drivers like that. And so that's usually a good thing for us. Is it kind of helps let them see that we're all a good team. They've got good resources. If they've got an issue, they've got Nate, they've got me, they've got Jake, and so they're not going to be left stranded. And they can feel comfortable with each other.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So we've talked about some of the nuts and bolts behind the principles that you've talked about. What about other things that may be legally required to hire somebody? What must get done? That's
a good question. That's a good transition to what I kind of consider the onboarding process. So at this point, you've kind of extended an offer. They've accepted the offer. You're ready to really bring them on board, and they're ready to start working. So the first thing is there's just some legal nuts and bolts that you have to do. You have to get some copies of some documents. The first two are the W-4 and the I-9. The W-4 is a IRS document. If you've ever worked for anybody, you've filled one out. Just basically says how much of their tax they want withheld. You write down the number of dependents and
right.
all that kind of stuff. And there's a formula. So it's that form. The other one's the I-9, and that's an immigration form just to make sure the person's legal to work in the U.S. In the U.S. So again, I'm going to have links to both of those forms on in the show notes for this episode. Then one of the next important things is just getting them set up on payroll. Payroll's kind of important.
You don't say.
Yeah. Usually people don't like working and not getting paid. I've got a really good example of that just in my recent life. My 16-year-old daughter has a job working at a local soda shop. It's kind of like a coffee shop, but with soda.
Welcome to Utah, everybody. There we have soda shops. These
unique to us.
Oh boy, yeah, indeed. Okay,
and they're good. But anyway, so
if you say so,
we were working. She was working at a soda shop over the summer.
Yeah,
loved it, and then went to the same. We moved at the beginning of the school year, and went to the same brand. Different soda shop up north, and had to get put into a new payroll system. So it was a little more complicated than just a regular transfer. Well, this other place was horrible. Like she worked there for almost a month and a half before she ever got her first paycheck.
Wow.
And that's just, and it put a really sour taste. It was her second job. It put a really sour taste in her mouth. And rightfully so.
Which is not good at a soda shop. No. Okay. You want that sweet, taste, right? Sugary soda taste.
At least if not sugar, aspartame. I mean, come on, you got to have One of those
Oh,
two.
it's so gross. Okay, go on.
All right. So you want to make sure you get that right. And you're paying your people on time the first time. You're paying them right every time. So payroll, it's kind of frustrating because it's one of those things that a payroll system's not cheap, but it's so critical. You don't, that's the fastest way to get somebody upset with you is not paying them.
And this is not a DIY situation, is what you're saying.
I don't think so.
The payroll system.
I would go for the payroll system because it's, as obviously paying your drivers is critical, but there's also other aspects to it that are complicated and they're a headache to try to figure out. And that's like making sure you withhold the right amount of taxes, that you're paying unemployment insurance and you're paying just all the state withholding taxes. Right. And there's a million things that you've got to be doing. Right. You got to make sure you do it right, or you're going to get yourself either in trouble with your drivers or in trouble with the government. And you don't want either of those.
Right. Yeah. And I didn't get into trucking because I'm a whiz at accounting, right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and play to our strengths here.
Absolutely. And so if this is your first driver that you're hiring, make sure you've got a good payroll system, and that, a good payroll provider will make sure that you've got the right state account set up, that you've got everything you need set up so that you're legal compliant and you're not going to have any problems. The one thing that can criminally get you in trouble as an employer of not doing correctly is your federal withholdings. If you're not withholding the right federal taxes and you're not paying those quarterly taxes, you're not taking your employees' FICA taxes out, so like the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security taxes, and you're not forwarding those on correctly, that's a criminal problem. And so you can get yourself into really big trouble if you're not doing it right.
So not DIY.
Right. Don't DIY it.
All right. So what's next?
All right. The next thing is you need to make sure you train them on the systems that they haven't been used. And this is another one of those things. It's preferably to do it in person. And so when I'm talking about systems they may not be familiar with, your electronic logging device, if they may have used one system and you have a different system, the systems are always pretty different. Some people figure it out just fine on their own, but a lot of people don't. And so it's good to kind of train them and show them, help them get logged in the first time, do that. If they've never operated a reefer or some other type of equipment, get them trained on that. Or
if they're going from a dry van to a flatbed or whatever.
Yeah. Make sure they understand how to operate the equipment. Or even with a reefer, if they're going from a carrier unit to a Thermo King unit, and they've never used Thermo King, the operations are slightly different. You need to make sure they understand how to use them. And trucks too. Like, we think driving a truck, you put it in gear and you go. Well, every truck's different. With the new technological advances, they're more and more complicated, especially if you've got like some of those collision avoidance things. Some of the tech on them now is starting to get decently complicated. And so if you're going from a Volvo to a Freightliner, or from a Kenworth to a Freightliner, there's going to be differences, and it's probably a good idea to walk the driver through those technical things. And a lot of times the driver is going to tell you, I've driven a truck, I know what I'm doing. Well, have you driven this truck in this model, and have you dealt with a collision avoidance system? It's good to kind of show them through, like, I'm not going to show you how to shift the gears. I'm going to show you how to.
You're not trying to be patronizing. You're just trying to make sure that, again, going back to the safe driver thing, it's like, hey, you might be a great driver, but I want to make sure you're a great driver on this truck.
Yeah.
So, that makes sense. Okay. Anything else?
Yeah. There's another thing that we find all the time is getting the paperwork back. Nobody gets paid unless paperwork gets submitted. And so one of the critical things, and sometimes it's a little more difficult than you'd think, is getting that paperwork back to the home office. And most of the time that just means, scanning it in and sending it back with an email or something like that. There's a lot of great scanning software that you can just load onto your phone, where you're essentially just kind of taking a picture of each page of a document, and it wipes it, it cleans it, and it makes it look just like a scanned PDF. And they do a great job. And so it's training them on how to use that, how to submit the paperwork while they're on the road, and make sure they know how to go through that process.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you've talked about in past episodes, this when you're out on the road driving, whether you're driving for yourself or you're an employee driver, there's a lot more that goes on now, or maybe not. It's not that there's more. It's just so much faster now than it was a generation ago before we were able to scan things on our phone on the road, right? So yeah, there's a lot that goes into that.
For sure.
Okay. So what else? You said we're training them on systems that they might need to use.
And then just making sure that they are familiar with everything in the truck and kind of where it's at. Specifically, every truck, most trucking companies go the route of having all like the registration documents, the insurance documents, the manual for the ELD, all that kind of stuff in a binder in the truck. And so just kind of familiarizing them with the binder, where to find everything. A lot of times you'll have some tools or things like, where the oils, like an extra thing of oil or antifreeze are stored, where you keep all that, just, pointing that out to them.
Okay. All right. Very good. So that's the systems and the equipment that you want to make sure they're familiar with. I assume we also want them to be familiar with the company itself, because you've got your own systems and policies in place, right?
You've got your own SOPs, you've got your own policies, like your drug policy, your employment policy, hours of service policies, those kind of things. You just want to make sure they're familiar with all of that.
Okay. All right. What else are we doing with these guys once, or gals, once they're hired?
Now we're kind of winding down to the end of that onboarding stuff, but there's a few things that you kind of have to do. You need to give the driver a fuel card. They've kind of got to be able to fuel the truck on the road. So a way to fuel the truck, and then another way to pay for over the road expenses. Some companies will just use the fuel card. Some companies will give them cash, and sometimes maybe just a company credit card. So there just has to be a method like that to pay for those, fuel and other incidentals that happen on the road.
Awesome. Okay, so we've interviewed the driver. We feel good about him. We extended the offer. They accepted it. And then was the blitz to get all of this stuff ready to go, get them ready to go, get the truck ready to go, all the paperwork and whatnot. And now this person is ready to drive for you.
They at this point should basically be ready to go. But there's a few things that you kind of as a company still need to do in the background. And it's really just kind of adding them. You need to make sure they're added to your random drug testing pool, or your consortium's the technical word for it. We should have at this point already got them approved by your insurance company, but then you have to formally say, hey, yeah, we have hired this driver. We want him added to our policy. So you need to do that, and then you need to add them to your workers' compensation policy.
Okay. Yeah, sure. All right. That makes sense. So now we're ready to go. Day one, what steps are we going to take once they actually show up to start driving?
That's a good question. So whenever you have a new person starting, you want the first impression of your company to be a good one. And so you want to make sure that your driver feels welcome and they feel part of your team. And so a couple things that I think are must-dos. First, you need to make sure the truck is ready and clean. Like you don't want to put a driver in a dirty truck. Sometimes that's a pain in the butt because some drivers leave the truck super dirty. So you either need to clean it out yourself, or you need to take it to a detail shop and get it cleaned out. And then make sure there's no lingering issues with it. A lot of the times, it may have a repair that really needs to be done. Do all that kind of stuff so that the truck's in good shape when it's first going down the road. The last thing you want is, as a new driver, to be driving down the road in a truck that's got an issue that's either going to be frustrating, annoying, or it's going to cause you to get stranded on the road. You don't want that kind of thing to happen.
Right.
So make sure everything's taken care of. It leaves a bad impression. If you're not taking care of your equipment, you think your driver's going to do it. If you're not keeping it clean, you think your driver's going to do it. No. So have it clean, have it ready to go, have it in good working running order. And then the chances that your driver will keep it that way are a lot greater.
It's if I'm stepping into a crappy truck that nobody took care of, why would I bother? Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So next up.
So still trying to kind of make them feel welcome, make them feel kind of part of the team. One of the things that we always do, and this is kind of goes back to that initial screening part, is we'll try to find out like what some of their biggest concerns are, or what some of the most important things to them are. Like, for example, do they want to be in a new truck versus an older truck? Do they, want to be home for certain family events or certain days, is health insurance important to them? There's a million things that can be important to them, or things that might be issues for them. So we try to find out what a few of those are, and we try to solve them. If it's something that's important to them, we try to accommodate that, like being home at a certain time or for certain things, or if they want to be in a newer truck, we make sure there's a plan that they're going to get a newer truck, and here's what needs to happen. And usually it just means that, like, we're buying a new truck, and they're second in line to get one, and we're planning on getting that second truck in 4 months, and they'll get it.
Right.
It's letting them know what those are. It might be that they want a really nice fancy mattress, and we may try to accommodate that.
So having some of this stuff ready to go right away means that, like you say, they're going to feel welcome. And it could be something as complex as you may not provide health insurance as a company, Haulin Assets, yet, but you can maybe, like you say, try to help them solve that problem. So, we went to the marketplace. We found here are some plans that might fit. We can't provide that for you, but we can provide the solution. Or in your case, if you had been hired on as a driver early on when you started Haulin Assets, it would, hey, look, I need an allotment of precisely 96 peanut M&Ms in the cab at all times. That's an easy fix. Right?
That would have been, for sure. It's kind of one of those things, like, it just makes them feel valued. And, like, especially if they tell you about some of these things in that early interview process, and then you solve them for them, it shows that you listen and that you value them. And I think that's really important. And in this market, when it's so hard to find drivers, that's a big thing that differentiates you from other employers, and will help you keep drivers in your trucks for a longer period of time, and which is ultimately going to help your company be more successful.
Yeah. I think it would be really easy for a new employer, somebody who's hiring their first driver or their first couple drivers, to just want to throw money at a problem and say, hey, I'll just pay them more. That's how they'll know that they're valued. And that, look, I mean, paying somebody more, it's great, but there is such a thing, as we've talked about in the past, there's such a thing as overpaying a driver that causes problems for you and them down the road. But there are other things you can do that make them not just feel valued, but actually helps them know that they are valued, right?
Yeah, like, some other ideas that I've got is, you can give them swag, like if you've got company hats or T-shirt or sweatshirt or something like that, giving them one of those right off the bat is a good thing. I talked about the new mattress. If a driver's missing something that's going to make their life a little bit more comfortable on the road, and you can provide that for them, it might be a good time to be generous and just do that and provide that. Like, one of the things that Nate's good at that I think's awesome is, he'll find out what the driver's favorite drink is and stock the fridge with their favorite drink and water. So they, the first day on the road, they go to load the fridge and they find all that there. It shows that you genuinely care about who's working for you.
Right. Unless, of course, somebody says my favorite is Scotch whiskey.
Probably not on the road. You're probably not stocking the fridge with that. Yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Very good. So any other thoughts on this particular subject before we start wrapping it up?
I just kind of wrapping up this piece of it is, when drivers know that you've got their back and you sincerely try to make a good environment for them, they're going to have your back too. If you're treating your drivers like crap, they're going to treat your company like crap. And so, what goes around comes around. And so, you've heard of the golden rule, right?
Yeah, I'm familiar. I'm familiar with its work.
There's two of them.
What?
There's two of them.
I know there's the golden ratio. But what's
I haven't heard the golden ratio. You might have to. So, it's not the one where the man with all the gold makes the rules. It's not that golden rule. Right. It's the golden rule where do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's really how you should treat everybody in life. And that includes, your drivers. Treat them as you would want to be treated, and they'll most likely treat you the same way. And so I feel like it's important to always be the big person, even if a driver's not treating you the way you would want to be treated. That doesn't give you a license to reciprocate.
Right.
treat people well.
Even a commercial license to reciprocate.
Thank
you, Chris. Yeah. Thank you.
We better shut the podcast. It's obviously been going way too long.
What are you well, I thought you meant we were that was our peak. We peaked. We got to get out. Yeah. Get out while the jokes land, right?
Now.
Okay, so any final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, one last piece of very important advice. Don't book a load until you've got the driver in the seat of the truck, or at the very minimum, turn the truck over to them.
Okay.
Because we've had it where they don't show, and
really?
You don't want that to happen. You don't want to be committed to a load and then not have a driver show up. So don't book a load until you've basically got a butt in the seat.
Okay, well, fair enough. All right, sounds good. So, Chris, I feel like we've kind of covered this topic pretty well. Now, the impact tip, as I understand it for today, is go read Colin Powell's book.
There you go. I like that one.
Pop quiz, Chris. What's the book called?
It is called...
It's been, 45 minutes?
It worked for me.
Okay.
It works. Yeah, it works for me. It worked for me. Something like that.
I love that. I love this book. I'm going to bring it and talk about it.
I can't remember names. I can't remember things, I can't remember book titles.
People can't see it on YouTube, but just off screen, I have a plaque with my name on it, so he can always remember. It's Craig. Craig.
Oh, yes.
All right, Chris. Well, this is good. This is what we promised at the beginning of the episode. I think we delivered. These are concrete things that must be done or should be done, can be done, depending on the tip for hiring a driver. So I hope this really helps people out. If you're looking to expand to a second truck or a 20th truck, and you're looking to refresh your system for hiring, then this is some good advice. So much appreciated. Anything else before we cut and run for today?
I would just say be consistent with how you do it. So develop a checklist that you kind of go through, that goes through all the, that screening, the onboarding process, and make sure you cover each one of those steps, or it's easy. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's easy to skip something and miss something. So a good checklist will help you through the process.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody, for listening. Like I said, if this was helpful, then we would love to see some positive reviews out there. So go leave a review for the podcast based on this monster of an episode. Usually we're going 20, 25 minutes. It's
been a while since we've had an episode this long.
This is a pretty decent one. So please go leave those positive reviews. We greatly appreciate that. Go to HaulinAssetsLLC.com for links and examples and all the stuff we talked about today. You're going to find the full show notes with all that stuff there. I have abbreviated show notes that come with the episode, but there's more. Okay, so go check out the full show notes. Find us on Facebook, and please tell your friends about the show. All right, Chris.
See you next time.
Have a good week.
See you.